From the School of Communication at American University in Washington, D.C., this is Media in the Mix, a space where we explore topics in communication at the intersection of social justice, tech and innovation, and popular culture. How has Hollywood changed over the course of one long, storied career? From nickel and dime shows, blockbuster epics, and contemporary tentpole IP films, to how industry changes have influenced award shows and the waxing and waning interest in them, Russell Williams has seen it all. Today's audiences aren't subject to appointment television, and their choices in how to consume content also influence award season. Williams has won 2 Oscars for sound and 2 Primetime Emmys for sound mixing, and was formerly a full-time professor in the School of Communication at American University. This episode is guest hosted by Bria Granville, Video Production Coordinator at SOC's Office of Communication and Outreach. Find out what industry insider Russell Williams thinks about these changes and more on this episode of Media in the Mix.
So thank you, Russell, for being here and taking the time out of your day to talk to me about award shows. I really wanted to pick your brain as somebody who's been in the industry for as long as you have and who has had a very accomplished career. I just kind of wanted to understand your perspective on award shows. Growing up, what was the general attitude about them? Were people excited about it? There's a huge shift in the way that people are viewing and perceiving award shows now to then. And we're of 2 different generations.
Well, Bria, thank you for the invite. Good to be in this conversation. And yes, you are talking to, of course, there were feature-length films well before I came along in the early 50s. We're talking back to the 1920s, which was my parents' generation. And it was a thing for them, to save up whatever little allowance they got and, go to the theater for a nickel or a dime and later on a quarter, et cetera, et cetera. And so by the time I came along, the DC native, we basically had 2 main avenues where we would view feature-length films. We would either go to downtown, so that's F Street, that's also 15th Street where Old Ebbitt Grill is. Basically, in that period of time I was growing up, that would have been, I believe, not the Translux Theater, but it would have been either the Lowe's Capitol or Lowe's Palace. And then on U Street, there were several theaters along there. The only one that's still standing, I think, is the Lincoln, but there was the Republic, the Booker T, other movie houses along there. There were neighborhood single screens. On Wisconsin Avenue, you have 2 still there, as far as I know, in DC, the Uptown, almost to the Maryland line is the Avalon. And the Warner Theater on 13th Street. In my era, that was strictly movies, where you all these days would know this is a live venue location. But, I grew up like other folks in my age group, where you had to leave home to go to the movies. And even in the 1980s, when VHS was introduced and you could kind of see movies at home, it wasn't nearly the kind of experience that people have now with their own home systems. All right. So we really did depend on going to movies, seeing it with an audience, grabbing your parents when something got scary, or, guffawing when everybody thought something was funny, and looking around to see if anybody else caught the joke. And because Hollywood, especially growing up on the East Coast, was this distant, magical land that, only a few people got a chance to enter. I wasn't at the age group when I first started going to films to really necessarily think, well, there aren't any black people on the screen, or there aren't enough black people on the screen, or there are not enough people of other ethnicities on the screen. That started probably with the film Lawrence of Arabia.
Right.
1962. Now, at that point, I had no idea about the politics of how Omar Sharif got to get that magical, magnificent, and as far as Western audiences, his introduction to the rest of the world on big cinema was like no other, and probably none since. But we really looked forward to Oscar night because, for the most part, we had seen these films. So sometimes we would go and see films that had black cast, the few that were actually on the screen, but we went to the big motion picture events. So Ben Hur is still one of my favorite movies of all time. Again, Lawrence of Arabia. In that period of time, there were a lot of biblically themed films. So I would guess, in terms of the scale, those are probably similar to your Marvel or your DC or your Harry Potter's, or my kids'
Yeah,
Lord of the Rings,
like
type presentations,
blockbusters.
blockbusters, and what in the industry are called tent poles. Tent poles, because, like a circus, if those acts don't make money, then the rest of the circus tent kind of falls in, meaning the studio is really, really in debt. And that's one of the things MGM faced when Ben Hur went into the theaters, and luckily saved MGM. It might not have been the first time they were facing bankruptcy, but it was probably the first time in my lifetime. Then a few years later, Shaft saved
Hmm.
MGM again from going into bankruptcy.
And that
But
was in
yeah,
the 70s, right?
yeah, that was in the either late '60s, early '70s. But back to the award show aspect, right? Everybody's looking really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of an African American, to get a glimpse of Sidney Poitier, in his
Mm-hmm.
tux, to go up there and actually receive his award, which he won for Lilies of the Field, and hear that very distinctive voice of his, and to see the nominees. And as a kid, the Hollywood experience is the furthest thing from my head in terms of a career path.
Right,
It's just like, this is what we did. We would cut grass or shovel snow or do chores, and in my case, run up the hill to the Coral Hills Theater and stay there as much of the day as possible to watch the films over and over again. In 1967, there was this film called In the Heat of the Night,
mm-hmm.
Sidney Poitier. So, Bria, in 1967, there was this film called In the Heat of the Night.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in 67, we already have Martin Luther King. Medgar Evers has already been killed. Malcolm X has already been killed.
Right,
The civil rights movement is on everyone's television. Vietnam is raging. The women's movement is raging. I mean, there's a lot of social unrest in the country.
right,
So by this time, I'm a lot more conscious of the fact that Sidney Poitier is an icon. That, I mean, he's making moves in such a way that I tell people in your age group and younger that for us, In the Heat of the Night was like your Black Panther.
mm-hmm.
The fact that he got to, and there's a word I hate to use now because of the additional context, but he got to slap this white man in the movie.
Right, yeah,
But more important than Sidney's great role in Rod Steiger as a bigoted sheriff, who actually won the Oscar for Best Actor that year, was this name Quincy Jones that was
right,
in the credits. And that's the first time I realized that African Americans were playing a serious role behind camera. I'm like, excuse me, he did the score? And that wasn't his first score, but that was the first one that, I saw his name on the credits. By that time, I was already into jazz, so I knew his background. And my dad's favorite singer until he died was Brother Ray Charles. So
mm-hmm.
he was one of the first performers I remember that I could hear his voice coming over the radio, and I would say, that's Ray Charles. So he did the opening number. And then I saw, I didn't like pack a bag and say, I'm going to Los Angeles. But that was the first time I started to think in terms of their career paths other than just acting.
Right,
So I assure you that the audience interest and all the other glamour that we associated almost exclusively with the Academy Awards, but the Academy Awards is still the granddaddy of the entertainment industry award shows.
right,
So
yeah,
it, of course, set the standard for how everyone else should, kind of conduct themselves in terms of the television broadcast. And obviously, there's the Nobel Prizes and their coronations and other things like that. But the entertainment industry, it was the Oscars.
right. No, the Oscars has been airing since what, 1953, 19
Earlier than that. Well, just about, yeah, I think.
like on television.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, they were held before that, but I think, yeah, 52 or 53 is the first broadcast.
first televised. So, I mean, before then, you had been admiring these big names like Sidney Poitier and getting to see yourself as a Black man reflected both in front of and behind the screen, Sidney and Quincy. And before then, like movies, movie theaters was like a big thing for you. Like as you were getting into the industry, was it your goal to get an award, get an Oscar? Was that important for you as a Black man working behind the screen, or was that just like, that's over there? That's not for me, but maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't.
Now, I have one buddy who was part of our volunteer radio workshop at American U in the 70s and early 80s. That was called Spirits Known and Unknown. And he insists that in 1979, when I went on the flight TWA, which you'd have to Google that because they're long gone, that I said at some point I was going to go out there and win an Oscar. But uh, let me be perfectly frank, Bria, when you get on that airplane to go to Los Angeles, the first thing you want to do is find a job, because even in 1952 or 53, whenever they had the first Academy Awards, going to Los Angeles and trying to get in the entertainment industry was not an original idea. So it was certainly not an original idea in 79. And so you look to the left and the right, front and behind you. Most of the people on that plane have some sort of dream that centers around the entertainment business. It may not be movies, it could be music.
Mm.
You know, some people might want to be in the representation aspect of it or the real estate aspect of it. But, you know, you're going to LA other than for something other than just to see the palm trees in many cases. Right. So the path just to getting employed, working your way around, meeting people, no social media, no cell phones, everything was hard copy, physical handshakes, burning gas. It took a lot longer to get established than it would for people in your age group and younger. Mm. For me, it took me 7 years just to get into the union that would allow me to be eligible to work on big studio projects. But when I got there and I saw the scale of what working at a studio looked like, I think the first studio lot I went on, which is now Sony, but that was the classic MGM lot, you know, and I'm standing there looking at all these people, you know, working on this set. And I stood on that stage floor and I said to myself, okay, Russell, you're going to have to commit 10 years to pursuing this goal before you can throw in the towel. Right. Because I saw that even the person called a grip, who's got a hammer in one hand and a roll of tape in the other, or tying knots or rigging something, he or she, and there were she's then, not as many as there are now, they know a whole lot more about this level of production than I did coming from NBC Washington, local documentaries and news in DC, and a couple of independent feature films, right? I'm like, these people built a home inside of a building just for a television show. Of course, now TV or series are the big thing. That's where a lot of the most creative content is in series. But I was a snob. I'm still a snob in many ways. But when I got there, I just wanted to work features. So it literally took me 7 years to get in the union. It took me 9 years to get on my first real feature film, which became an American classic. Didn't know it at the time, but once it was released, it became something that people still talk about. That was called Field of Dreams. All sorts of stuff that I'm like, okay, now I'm working with these people. You know, people who I thought were the, you know, I would never be in the same room with them.
Right.
Much less, you know, working side by side, responsible for preserving one aspect of their performance. And then the very next year was Glory. And the very next year, actually the same calendar year we shot Glory, we also shot Dancing with Wolves. But thank God, Dances didn't get released to the next year, which meant I wasn't competing with myself, which happens to actors more often than anybody else, where they have two movies up in the same year. And it kind of splits their vote. So that journey, I would say, paid off. But again, a lot of people come out there and they might be there 10, 20, 30 years and they never get the stars to align in such a way that they get the recognition that they had hoped for.
Right.
The real button for me was that my first real professional training, in other words, how to deal with strangers. Okay, I was fine at church, I was fine with my family and friends, fine at school, fine with elders, just in general. But my
Mhm.
first real training in dealing with the general public
Mhm.
was at this little place called McDonald's.
Oh.
Good morning. Welcome to
Classic
McDonald's.
place.
How may I serve
Right.
you? Would you like to try a new double hamburger or a double cheeseburger? Right. So I had to run that. And somebody who I probably would never speak to anyway, but once they come into the store, right, then I've got to treat
Yep.
them
Just,
like.
yeah.
So
Like,
that, a few years later became, hi, I'm Russell Williams. I'm your sound mixer. Where's our first setup this morning? Right. So I'm working a McDonald's commercial,
mm,
recording the sound for a McDonald's commercial, and called a friend of mine because I was so unsophisticated in terms of how to find out who got nominated the year that Field of Dreams and Glory were both released. Right.
right.
So I said, okay, well, I can wait till it's in the LA Times tomorrow, but who can wait that long? I didn't have sense enough to just say, well, I could call the Academy and say, well, who got nominated in sound, right?
Did
No,
you have a direct line to the academy?
no. I mean, but yeah, anybody would. That morning, you could
Right.
just call them up, and because they're taking press calls all day.
Mm,
But I said, I know who would have that information. My buddies back in D.C. who still work for the media.
right. Yeah.
So I called another AU alum, a lady named Joya, who was working for CBS at that time, because I knew it'd be on the teletype. Okay, you young people Google teletype,
Mm,
and you'll see this thing with a long rolls of paper coming out of it. And so that would have the full nominations list.
okay.
And she called and left a message on my uh, uh, answering machine. You had to Google that too and get a picture of it because that ear is long gone too. And it said, yes, Russell, you got nominated for Glory. While I'm working a McDonald's commercial. And I'm thinking, when I'm working a McDonald's commercial, I have no idea that I'm going from flipping burgers and putting fish sandwiches in the grease, that I'm actually going to take the Nestea plunge, go to Los Angeles, ply my trade, and then be on the show of shows in terms of the entertainment industry. Of course,
Mhm.
it's many years later. But yeah, I mean, and even then, I think the Oscars. I mean, those were the first 2 years Billy Crystal was the host.
Right.
Massively more audience members worldwide
Mm,
in what we've seen in the last 10 years. Just massively more people. But
right.
the industry has changed considerably. It's like seismic shift.
It has changed a lot, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I know for the Oscars at least, in it's like always been the most viewed award show. It's always been like the biggest deal to a lot of people, and even in the last years, viewership has declined drastically. Like in the last 20 years, probably like by like what, like
No, it's
30 million,
yeah, I
like dropped
mean,
30 million
and
people.
it depends on the show because the Oscars have
Mm,
lost a precipitous amount of the audience. The Grammys, I thought would maintain more of the audience because at least they stopped being more of the handing out the awards
mhm,
template to being more heavy on performances. And
right.
and some of the years of performances are really awesome, but their viewership has been on a deep slide. The Tonys, I mean, the Tonys, I don't think travel as well nationwide because
Mhm,
unless you get to see those shows either in New York or you see a road, you know, review or a road cast of it, it doesn't generally stay in people's heads the way
mhm,
the Oscars and then, of course, the Emmys, which is also, I think even when I won my Emmys, it was a 2-day event. Now I believe it's a 2 weekend event because they have so many more categories. The same with the
mhm,
Grammys.
right.
So a lot of what has been presented you won't see on the show at all. And then they might have a little streamer at the bottom saying awarded earlier. So long story short, with today's audiences who don't really have much of anything that you would call appointment television.
No.
How
Um,
are you going to then rally this massive audience?
right. I think there's a lot of like shift I mean, not only the just like the introduction of the internet and social media and streaming, which just allows people to stay home and watch their TV shows whenever they want. They can watch movies whenever they want, but also just like the proximity to celebrity
Right.
has changed a lot. Like I feel like when at least when award shows started being televised, there was this mystique about celebrity and a lot of interest in like, oh, they're stars, and there's a distance there. But now, especially with social media, you're so close to them. Like they can post and you feel like you know them, that you feel closer, and then also people are just not as like mystified by them, and so it doesn't really compel them to want to watch the award. It doesn't compel them to want to watch people win.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so I feel like that is one of the biggest breakdowns. And I don't know whether that's talked about a lot. I don't know what you think about that or if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh no, yeah, and I would agree that okay. So in the era, even back in my mom's period of time going to the movies, and my dad, they had the so-called paparazzi, the tabloid
Mm,
press, and they would try to bring these people back down to size. Somebody's having an affair, and
right.
this person was caught, in a compromising position. But for the most part, as you said, the movie stars and TV stars still were revered as folks a cut above.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Um, Social media certainly has cut into that. The fact that by them being more familiar to the average person, through other platforms that you have available to you, Twitter, Instagram, et cetera, maybe there is not that shine anymore. And
Mm,
I think also with, phenomena like YouTube,
mm,
you have people that maybe making a lot more money than the so-called movie and TV stars, and they're doing something that's seemingly a lot more accessible.
mm,
I would also say that because the Oscars and maybe the Emmys I think should have a little bit more of a popular audience, uh, but the Oscars had set themselves apart in the sense that whether something made a lot of money wasn't
right.
the criteria that we as voters should be swayed by, unless it made money because it was really good and it was also an
Mm,
action picture.
right.
If that was a genre. So what has happened year after year, uh, because most of the Best Picture winners for the Academy Awards really don't hit high uh, on that ledger in terms of being big money winners in most cases, then that means that there's a lot less interest in seeing who did win Best Picture. And that's
Right.
one of the reasons it's said that, say, Dark Knight, since Dark Knight didn't get nominated for Best Picture, and it very well should have, in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
that's when they started going back to, well, we could have up to 10 nominees for Best Picture to try to get a more well rounded view of what was released in any calendar
Mm,
year. And there have been several suggestions as to how to increase the audience, but I don't know if that's realistic. I mean, we already have the People's Choice Awards,
right.
which is strictly a popularity contest.
Mm,
As an Academy member, but not Academy governance, I have certain views about what the Academy could do, but the voting membership still kind of, you can almost count on them to take the more conservative choices of the choices that are offered to them in terms of cutting edge films.
mm,
Okay. They may say, well, this is worth a nomination, but we're going to anoint this one over here.
mm,
So that is one of the things I think maybe with the increase in membership and the diverse
mm,
population that has taken the academy, I hope, in the direction of keeping it in the category of looking at what's moving the art form forward.
Mm.
Not just saying, oh, this was a really good redo of something that was done twice before. How are we going to take the art form forward in terms of innovative storytelling and stories that
Right.
haven't gotten big screen treatment? If
Right.
but
Right.
again, I'm a snob when it comes to certain topics like that. So, I, you know, I want, I look, I'm rooting for the filmmaker.
Yeah.
When I go in there, I want to be taken on a journey. And
Mm.
before I could afford to travel, before I had been anywhere other than the DMV or up and down the Eastern Seaboard, you know, going two parts of the world through, cinema was the
Mm.
only way I got to go to these different continents until I was actually on those different continents. I was like, wow, okay, it looks something like the way the production designer did it, but it's a lot more interesting than
A
what
little
they had in
different.
that film,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Details are a little bit different. But I mean, you touched on like diversity a bit. I mean, that's been a big conversation, diversity in Hollywood and diversity behind the scenes and diversity on in the academy, especially whenever Oscars So White was a thing. I think in like what 2016, just like calling out the lack of diversity, like the intense lack of diversity, and how that felt intentional. Spurred this reaction to like, oh, we're gonna like have more like people of color and diverse voices in the academy to vote as voters. We're gonna try to like have more nominees and everything. But I don't know that that necessarily has translated to more viewership in terms of like the audience. Like and especially during the pandemic, the viewership or the interest in award shows has like waned dramatically.
Right, right, right.
But diverse leads and the viewership for those things grew, but it didn't translate to the award shows. Do you think that even though like diversity is good, is it the thing to draw audiences the way that the Academy or the way that leadership in Hollywood
Hmm.
hopes that it will be or thinks that it will be?
Well, I would say I think the one film that was, and no pressure on Ryan Coogler, which of course gives away the film I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But if Black Panther had not been a box office monster,
Right.
then I think the conversation about diversity may have just kind of just fizzled out in terms of the decision makers
Mm-hmm.
who for many years would say, well, this film doesn't travel or this film doesn't have an audience outside of US borders. And in certain cases, certain films where a masterful understanding of the language and the idiom and the humor may have made some films less likely to travel, but films that didn't depend strictly on that, which is why action films tend to do well because it's mostly slam bam and boom boom
Mm-hmm.
pow pow and screech screech. You know that had been presumed to be the reason why films with diverse casts didn't travel. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think when Oscars So White hit, even though it said Oscars, all the other academies in the entertainment business also heard that clarion call because they were like, "Oh wow, we need to start looking at our membership and our governorship and see what we can do because the industry started, and I'm talking about the industry started in Jim Crow America. So, of
Right.
course, the population and the people that we saw on the Oscars and when the Emmys came along and the Grammys came along, basically were coming from one, stretch of demographics.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and then because it takes you X amount of career and success and um, honorifics to be part of any of these academies. None of these academies, I think, want to be looked at the way I'm getting ready to categorize them, but similar to the sports halls of fame. One of the things they end up doing by default is keeping people out.
Right.
You have to earn your way in. Okay. The difference in sports and the entertainment industry, though, is in the sports world, we pretty much know everybody's statistics. Now, you
Mhm.
may not know how many people voted for XYZ player when it comes to getting or not getting into the Hall of Fame, but we know how many balls, how many strikes, how many hits, how many home runs, how many touchdowns, how many goals on, and, all through their career, right? How many aces, how many unforced errors, all of that stuff in sports. But we don't have that sort of transparency in most of these entertainment industry academies. So there's
Mhm.
always the question,
Right.
okay, but let's go back to the audience at large. I don't know if the way any of these award shows that are structured that are basic that are, as far as I'm concerned, are based on a 1950s model.
Mhm. Right.
And it was when the when I was taking classes at American U as an undergrad, we were literally in the mass communication world. We didn't have the opportunity to narrowcast, and say, okay, we've got a show designed just for this, you know, group of the audience, this viewership or podcast that appeal just to this, and it may be entertaining for anybody, but this is our target. These are our core audience members. We had to make shows that were going to appeal across a wide swath, and I don't know how sustainable that is even going forward because again, the viewing culture is so fractured.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm assuming if there's no new plague on the horizon and we can really go back into the movie theaters and take our mask off and feel comfortable that we're not going to bring home someone uninvited or something uninvited,
Mhm.
it still is. You would find more people going to see the big tentpole event productions, and maybe after Halloween when the big dramas are what we call Oscar bait are on the screen. You might see a bump up in viewership. But in the old days, you would see if such and such a film won an Oscar for something, like Coda, I think got a big bump in ticket sales after it won Best Picture. And I think
Mhm.
also Parasite did, but it doesn't happen every year.
No.
Where the studios are encouraged to put a movie back on the screen because that means they've got fresh money to spend for marketing and advertising and things like that. I think
Mhm.
the award season probably will be shortened again,
Mhm.
and I think the shorter the award season, the easier it is to sustain whatever interest there is in award shows, because bing, 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 and get them out of the way.
Just
But
one after another.
yeah, to stretch them out over the spring, I don't know if that's sustainable because that means that how are we going to keep the audience interest in these films for weeks at a time, especially if the audience hasn't been to the theater in big numbers?
Right. Right. I mean, and as we're making our way back to the theater, I mean that. I mean, it could come back, right? That
I mean,
interest. I
I
mean,
hope it
people.
does.
But I mean, going to the movies is still considered to be a bit of like an experience, like a bit of a luxury experience. You get out of the house, you get to go see whatever you want to see in like on a huge screen.
Right.
I know there are some movies that I feel like I have to just for the experience and
Oh,
just to be there
please.
with the audience,
Yeah.
have to see
Yeah.
on a big screen. Um, and then just like visually, that is what drives me a lot. But for myself, I don't typically watch award shows. I like will pay attention to the nominees and the winners,
Hmm.
or I'll watch moments on YouTube after the fact,
Right.
or on TikTok if they post them. But I don't usually watch. I don't want to sit through like 3 hours. I don't think anybody
Hey.
really wants to sit through like three
Hey.
hours. When I was growing up, it was a little bit different because I would watch it with my parents, but and
Right.
it was just
Right.
on. But no, nobody's really like since nobody really even has cable anymore. Or at least younger generations don't have cable. Nobody's like sitting down to watch it live the way that they used to.
Yeah. Actually, I had to. How did I watch the Oscars? I had to go in and get some 7-day free subscription because
Right.
I cut the cord. It's like these cable people, it's like, so the Super Bowl, the Emmys, the Oscars, the Grammys. There were no Golden Globes this year at all, and the question
No.
as to whether there will be a Golden Globe uh, broadcast in
Right.
2023 is still up to the HFPA. But I don't know if it's as relevant for younger generations, and it's just, to me, it's just another signal of how things have changed because of one of the things that you mentioned. It's not as common that people sit down, even when we were watching a television show, we were all watching MASH at the same time in our respective time zone. Right,
Mm,
so you could be on the phone waiting for that, or should I say the Cosby Show, or should I say other popular shows. Even if you were talking to a relative or a friend in another state, they were seeing the same thing on their screen at the same time you were. So there's very little of that by comparison because of
mm,
streaming. So to then have to rally everybody around to see an award show that is, as you say, I mean, when you're in the room,
mm.
it could be a really short night or it could be a really long night.
Yeah.
If you're
That's so
nominated
true.
if your nomination category comes up in the first hour and you don't get to stand up, now do you leave or do you
Mm,
sit through the rest of those 2 hours in the room? You know what I'm saying? And you're seeing other people coming home or coming back with a statuette in their hand or whatever the actual presentation is. So it's a long show in the room too.
right. I mean, if there are like simple steps that you would suggest to the Academy, like if you could suggest, what are some things that you would suggest to improve like the run of the Oscars? Like take this year as an example, what would you do different?
Well, I was very happy that now some people mistakenly think that Will Packer was the first African American to produce the Oscars.
Hmm.
I want to say he's probably third or fourth because Quincy Jones sat in that chair first, and I think that was the second time that Whoopi Goldberg was the host. So um, it's important that you have people producing the show that understand television.
Right.
Okay, and I'm talking about television back when we used to have variety shows and things like the stuff that I grew up with. The people who produce those type of shows really knew how to keep the pace going, to
Hmm.
keep something interesting going on camera. And for me, the Oscars would look a little different, and I'm not sure how logistically we would accomplish that. But say, for instance, the five uh, women nominated for Best Actor.
Hmm.
Okay. If there's time enough, which of course the nominations are handed out generally, in my era would have been around Valentine's Day. If the nominations could be earlier, and we know people are working in many cases, but it seems like, yeah, you have some live music performances, which we do have here and there. But I would like to see these nominees, and maybe you could mix them up with the men,
Hmm.
but do some role reversals. Or let's take a classic scene out of Streetcar Named Desire, or a classic scene out of In the Heat of the Night, or a classic scene out of The Usual Suspects, and have some of that year's nominees do, a spinoff on. I did like the fact that this year they did have some cast reunions there to hand out some awards. But, I think the other thing that is a missed opportunity, which maybe you have a short snippet on the broadcast, but then on YouTube, there may be a direct link for you to see how this particular sequence in Dune was edited and
Hmm.
how, since we got kicked off the show in terms of doing sound, but how they buried microphones in the sand
Right.
dunes in order to get the sound of the sand shifting for Dune, and how cinematographers have to do this, and what was the deal with why was this hair style team worth a nomination?
Right.
So that I think would appeal to the people who are potential filmmakers. And then there are also
Hmm.
people who watch this. Well, how was that done? And so you see the green screen, and then you see the actual person, and then you put the composite together. And they've done that in snippets here and there on other
Mhm.
shows. But I don't think they've really, like say on the Tonys, I don't think they've really leveraged the power of having these people who are nominated for the acting roles perform something as part of the
Mhm.
show. And I mean, that would entertain me. I don't know if that's going to be a big draw for everybody else.
I would
Um,
find that interesting, honestly.
and a lot of times even the best song and the best score, they pretty much always play the best songs, and but the artists
Mhm.
who have written them and who performed them. But visually, I don't know if that is bumping the audience up the way it may have. Even if it is
Right.
Lady Gaga or even if it is Beyonce, who had a great opening number,
Yeah, I really like that
really
one.
great opening number. I mean, that was
Yeah.
real television. So you're producing the show, you really have to know what makes live television breathe. And we're talking about the broadcast era. Now that the
Mhm.
audience is so fractured, I mean, one of our alums, who was a former student of mine, said that one of the reasons that Walking Dead became so successful is they figured out how to keep audience interest with that two-screen format, and then while you're waiting for the next season to begin, they had you engaged the entire off season online.
Mhm.
The academy probably has to do, and the academies plural probably have to do more of that, so that
Mhm.
the younger people, the people who are interested in the business in terms of how do I get into this august body, and have
Mhm.
sessions with folks who are respected designers and directors. And I mean, some of that stuff is on there courtesy of Variety and Hollywood Reporter, um, Deadline, things like that. And I think the Academy does have things on their website that highlight this,
Mhm.
but they need to really pump up the volume during the rest of the year to build an audience, since the movie theater attendance, if it does go up, still doesn't automatically mean your viewership is going to go up with it.
Right. I think with that, I don't have any more questions for you, and I appreciate our conversation. Thank you so much.
Media in the Mix is a production from the School of Communication at American University. Our podcast is available for listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Anchor, and wherever else you can stream podcasts. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn to see how our community is changing media one step at a time. Catch you on the next one.